Psychological damage to the population. This is a real cost. Psychological damage to soldiers, whether the U.S. soldiers, Iraqi soldiers, what have you. Mitch had and has psychological damage, right? It's not to be sneered at. Consider the following cost that economists cannot capture, cannot measure. They like to put a dollar sign on everything. You can't put a dollar sign on this kind of thing. Here's an Iraqi woman living in a house that has been targeted for bombing. Okay? Her 3 children, young children, die in the bombing. She suffers psychological damage. Okay? And it goes on forever. It doesn't disappear, it goes on forever. Right? Now, what the economists would measure is the cost of the treatment that she would be subjected to by some psychiatrist if that treatment were available. Right? So that would be many thousands of dollars. That's not a cost. That's income to the psychiatrist who's having a problem here. It's an income to the psychiatrist who is undertaking that treatment, right? Should be sure it's a cost from one end, but it's an income from the other end, right? All these developments are costs. Environmental damage, which is enormous in Iraq. Go back to Vietnam for those of us who are on the older side, right? U.S. Military sprayed, for all practical purposes, Vietnam with Agent Orange, defoliant, right? Those environmental costs continue in Vietnam. You still see children born deformed as a consequence. That's cost, right? You still see problems with agriculture. People are still running around in fields with unexploded ordnance and setting off bombs, right? That's a cost. It's an ongoing cost, right? And that's just Vietnam, right? What used to be part of Indochina or Indochina. You should add to these costs the political disintegration of Iraq. Okay? What was once a relative for that part of the world, or any part of the world in the present period, what was once a very progressive regime, particularly with regard to the status of women. Right? Women's rights in Iraq were better than any other Middle Eastern country. Right? It's now a backwater, and it now ranks 175th out of 182 on the corruption index. It's one of the most corrupt political regimes in the world, right? So regardless of what you think of Hussein, regardless of what you think of the Ba'ath regime, which was put into power actually by the United States government, right? You've taken a relatively modern economy, relatively modern society, etc., and you've reduced it to the backwater that now exists. So what are these costs? We don't know, right? If you look at death, mainly civilians, it's mainly civilian Iraqis, not military, right? From just the most recent second war, 2003 to the present, the estimates range from 105,000 to over 1 million. What's the exact number? We don't know, right? In comparison, U.S. forces suffered, by the numbers I looked at, 4,408 deaths through February 2012, 31,992 wounded. Notice, those numbers are very precise. U.S. military keeps good records, right? As Rumsfeld once said, do you know who these two are?
Ray, the Rumsfeld too.
The Rumsfeld too. Ray, stand up. Stand up. Come on, stand up. Well done. And they will need financial support. Okay? Some of us have pledged that financial support. You pledged that financial support. Whether it's $5 or $500, doesn't matter. You pledge it. Okay. So anyway, the U.S. military keeps very good records. Rumsfeld says, we don't care about body counts. That is Iraqi or Afghanistan body counts. And if one were to undertake a proper costing of the Iraq war, then one should include the psychological damage to soldiers who continue to suffer consequences long after the end of official hostilities. The costs are only one side of the equation. There's also benefits. Who benefits? Well, one name that rings a responsive bell is Halliburton. You should look at the oil companies. You should look at major U.S. and other corporations for whom, or who, in whose interests this war was undertaken, as was the war in Vietnam, as was the British war in Kenya, as was the go down the list. Okay? The people who own those corporations who benefit from such activities don't, of course, engage in any of the actual fighting, and they risk no death or injury. We hear a lot about risk takers these days. These people are not risk takers. They don't take any risks. They glom on to all the benefits. People like Lucky, Mitch, etc. take the risks, right? But they're just disposable, right? If they're dead, killed, maimed, whatever, they can be replaced, right? You got a lot of people looking for jobs. It's a job, right? You get paid for this, right? You're a hired worker, right? Okay. And whether you're working in a coal mine or whether you're working in the fields of Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever the case may be, you get injured, killed, well, that's life, right? So the people who benefit don't care about the welfare of those who do take the risks. They're disposable, expendable. The only concern that those people have is that the revenues generated relative to the private costs incurred, not opportunity costs, not social costs, which are irrelevant anyway. The revenues relative to the private costs are positive, and that's called profit. We live in a profit-taking, profit-making, profit-seeking form of economic organization, and that will lead to things like the war in Iraq. And that takes us into a different sphere of analysis. But so, at the end of the day, I doubt very much that anyone can come up with a reasonably accurate measure of the cost of the war against Iraq. However, any such measure that does not adequately account for the human costs, figured very broadly, as Lucky, Mitch, and I have spoken to, and those associated with environmental degradation, any such measure that does not include these costs is not only dead wrong, but it's an insult to our intelligence. And as Mitch says, right, It's time to, in fact, get smart. Now, I want to speak very briefly to the theme of the forum, because I think there are two mistakes here. Right? If you go to the subtitle, how do we evaluate the legacy of 9 years of war in Iraq and prevent our repeating mistakes in Iran and elsewhere? First of all, it's not 9 years, it's 22 years. And I think that's very important, right? The second thing, and more fundamentally an error, is that this is not a mistake. Since World War II, the United States government has ordered military incursions in various parts of the world over 80 times. Now, most of those episodes we don't have knowledge of. We have forgotten, right? We remember Vietnam, we remember Iraq, we remember Afghanistan. We don't remember the Sudan, we don't remember Libya, we don't remember, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Over 80 times. And that's just the United States. That's not England, that's not France, that's not Germany, right? That indicates that we're not talking about mistakes here. We're talking about systemic policy. And there has to be a reason for that. So the question is, what is the reason? It doesn't advantage us, right? If anything, it costs us, right? Either we're over there dying or getting maimed or psychologically damaged or whatever, or we're paying in taxes, right? And I don't want to get into modern money theory here, but, you know, we pay taxes, and if you look at, it's very interesting, right? I'm not suggesting that this is in fact valid, but if you look at the growth in the national debt, it parallels the growth in defense spending, right? It's a very interesting relationship, okay? So, what are the costs? There are costs to us, there are costs to Lucky, to Mitch, right? There are costs in particular to the Iraqis, to the Vietnamese, to the Kenyans, right? To the world as a whole, right? So you have to start thinking about the nature of the economic system within which we exist, what it's designed to do, what it has to do in order to survive, right? And whether you want to continue with that. That's, for a bunch of Quakers, that's a pretty big agenda. Right? Now, well, of course, you could be a Nixon-type Quaker. I mean, I don't know how many Quakers. You could be a Nixon-type Quaker, and be a warmonger, and whatever the case may be, but most of you people are decent people, right? Or you wouldn't be here, right? So think about what decency requires in the current period and what you're going to do about it. And before you go out there and make revolution, you know, empty your pockets, take up a collection, write a check, give Mitch and Lucky your credit cards. I'm sure they'll be safe and sane in their usage, and support them. Okay? All right, that's it.
Thank you, Dr. Henry. And point well taken.
The name is John.
John. Thank you, John. Point well taken.
Doctors are all over the place.